Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today on how to teach students to use Microsoft Teams and Office 365. My name is Sam. I am a senior consultant with Tablet Academy. I'm a former English teacher and head of department. I've got lots of experience working in education, and what I now do is provide training around the use of technology in classroom spaces, and I do work with students around how to get the most out of technology in the classroom space as well. I do present on behalf of Microsoft quite a lot, so you might have seen my face before. Hello again if you have. Please do put some comments into the chat. Let us know you're here, and if you've got any questions at all, please do post those, and we'll answer those kind of as we go along. So, say hello. There we go. So this session is being delivered by Tablet Academy Education. We are a consultancy company around the use of technology, as I said before. But the key thing is that this is actually being provided through Microsoft. And so we're really pleased to be able to offer this session on behalf of Microsoft here. Okay, so in terms of our takeaway resources, we always kind of put together a Wakelet, and so please feel free to use the Wakelet there. And what I'll also do is put a link in the comments as well. Okay, so let me just do that here. There we go. Okay, so you'll find there in the Wakelet the Microsoft Learn Educator Centre code that you can go and redeem, and I'll also be adding some different resources from things that we covered today into that Wakelet. It's a live document, so we will be adding some content into there. Please feel free to use that in the coming weeks. Okay, so thinking about the student experience and thinking about Office 365 and Microsoft Teams particularly, over the last, at least the last 2 years certainly, many schools have adopted Microsoft Teams and Office 365 in response to the pandemic, and even schools that haven't sort of had adopted it prior to the pandemic, many kind of weren't using perhaps all of the different feature sets and so on. So we've got schools in different arenas in terms of how far along the journey they are with Microsoft. I think the key thing to understand is quite often for schools, certainly in my experience, is that the students have very much been sort of shown what they need to know to get along. So perhaps they know how to access assignments, perhaps they know how to log into their Office 365, but they may well have missed out some of the key sort of things that will help them to understand the platform, but also to help organise themselves as well. And so that's really what I want to cover today. Is thinking about, sort of the student experience with Office 365 and particularly with Microsoft Teams. So we've obviously got the Teams environment. They're probably using assignments already, and certainly kind of, if not in all classes, in many different classes, they might be using things like reading progress, the immersive reader, they might be using OneDrive and Outlook, but what we often find is that there's a disconnect between them understanding kind of how all of those things link together and how they can get the most out of using Office 365 and Microsoft Teams. So I just want to kind of cover some key sort of almost back to basics first of all, and then we'll go through some different hints and tips, different things that they can utilize within the Office 365 environment, that sort of we can actually think about their experience with it as much as us using it. I think sort of in many cases for teachers, we very much focus on, we need to set an assignment, we need them to access the assignment and so on, but actually they can get a very well-rounded experience from understanding kind of some different things. So we'll go through and kind of demo some of those things today. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just bring across a student window. Okay, let's just pick this one here. So I've logged into office.com with my Office 365, my email address and password. Now, depending on whether you're in primary sector or whether you're in the secondary sector or FE and HE, obviously the password implications of that will be different depending on how you're logging in. The key thing to consider, I think, is thinking about kind of for students, them understanding that they can access their Office 365 on any device, sort of at any time, potentially using just using office.com. And even if that's just through the browser, as I'm doing here, actually that sort of is a very powerful way to access the 365 environment. So they don't need to have a device that has things like the Word, so things like the Office suite saved locally onto the computer in the desktop version. They can be using kind of the cloud-based versions of all of those software. And so effectively they can still build up their skills at home, even if they don't have access to sort of high-level PCs and that sort of thing. They can use any device to be able to access Office 365. So I think, sort of when you're looking at getting students kind of used to logging in, going through that route of going through office.com, assuming that you haven't got your students logging in via a third-party portal, in which case then you'll need to give them the instructions that are related to that third-party portal. But if they are just logging in directly to 365, office.com is a great way to see that they can do that. Something else to point out, depending on licensing, the likelihood is they may well have the opportunity to install the Office suite onto their computer. So if they do have a PC at home, they do have a Mac, they do have, sort of a device at home, they can install Office. And if they've got things like an iPad or a tablet, then they can also use that to access the apps that are related to Teams, Outlook, and then Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and so on. So they do have this install Office option, which they won't necessarily know of, because if they're using school computers, generally kind of they're using the software that's saved on the computer that's provided by school. But if they are at home, they do have potentially, depending on licensing, access to this install Office and then the Office apps. Okay, if they are on a tablet or an iPad, they can go to the different stores. So whether it's the App Store or the Google Play Store, and they can download the software in the same way that we can as well. Okay, so that's something perhaps worth talking to students about if you haven't already. Okay, so thinking about sort of Office 365 initially, quite often we'll direct them, potentially straight to something like Teams. It's worth considering that we don't just have Teams available here. We do have a whole range of different options for applications. So teaching them about the waffle, the app launcher in the top left-hand corner, and that they can navigate between different things. So for instance, they can navigate between, say, Word, and then if they needed to jump back from, let's pick up a Word document here. Okay, let's pick a different one. Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay. So if we're opening up that document there and we're in Word, teaching them that they because it's saving live, and they may well not understand this, they may well not know this, but it's saving live. So therefore they can move from here, as long as it says saved at the top, they can move from here to somewhere else. While we are here, it's worth just pointing out also that if they're not sure where something is saved, they can actually see that by dropping down the option here. They can see the file name. Perhaps they can adjust that if they need to, and they can see the location of the document. They can also see their own version history of that document. So if they make a mistake, they actually can see the version history if they need to. That might be worth showing with older students rather than the younger ones, but certainly thinking about kind of students who might make a mistake or might want to go back and change something, they've got that version history there. Okay, so if we are in that Word document and we realise actually we need to quickly email our teacher, then we can jump from here into Outlook, we can jump from here into Teams, we can jump from here into any of the other software. We know that because we're using that, but actually kind of having that conversation with students about the different applications they have available to them and being able to move and navigate between those is often very useful for students to understand. Okay, so if they do want to get back to the main home screen, they can just click on the Office at the top there. So it'll take them back to the home screen. So getting them to kind of feel very confident around navigating around the Office 365 portal can help them to understand where something's happened. Okay. So we just got a comment come through around file structure and how important that is, and that some staff struggle to decipher where files are stored. So therefore, sort of what's happening for students. It's a really good point, actually. And I think sort of this got to be about how the teacher structures files and where teachers kind of, sort of replacing files. So, for instance, if we're using in Teams the class materials, it's got to be a case that the students know how to access kind of what's in the class materials and know that that's not for them to edit. And the biggest problem that we have, I think quite often, and the disconnect between teachers and staff, is staff putting things in the wrong place. And so I think the key thing is, if you've got a centralized SharePoint area that you're using, which can be a really useful way to organize your resources, to have kind of that centralized permissioned SharePoint space that sort of you have your staff resources based in, that you then access those to bring those to your class area. That can be really, really sort of useful for keeping things well structured. But even just from a teacher point of view, if I just jump over to the teacher here, utilizing kind of the class materials within the class itself means that students don't have editable access to those files. Now, the biggest problem that we've seen, particularly during early lockdown and certainly during actually the whole process, where people were making channels, and every channel makes a folder. So every time we make a channel, it makes a fresh folder. And the issue is that students have editable access to any documents that go into those folder areas. And then we've got a disconnect for students as well as staff around, well, I'll just go in there and start editing that document because I don't understand where the document I'm meant to be editing is. And so thinking about kind of how we structure our resources. Now, whether we do that, as I say, in a more centralized space, and then we draw them down to the class materials, whether we hold them in a centralized space that we tab at the top here, like we've got this document library here. So rather than using the files in the team, we're actually accessing those from a SharePoint shared document library. We can decide kind of how we approach that. But I think the key thing, it's very different conversation between the primary and the secondary / FE and HE sector, because of the level of files and also sort of the level of interaction. But certainly I think having a centralized space that either you're copying down to your class materials or that you're tabbing in the top here can be really helpful for staff to understand kind of structure. And it does mean, in that case, we're protecting those documents from students editing them. And I think, students need to understand, where are the documents I access that are read-only, where are the documents that I access that are for me to edit. Now, the easiest way to do that is to think about assignments. So when we're thinking about kind of how we give students access to documents that they edit themselves, depending on the age group of the students, we can just ask them to create a file in their OneDrive. So if I turn around and say, okay, sort of here we've got Angela. Okay, Angela, can you create for me a Word document, for instance? They can just go in, create a blank Word document, and then they could share that with me. Now, the benefits of that, we're developing an independence for students. We are giving them, sort of access to skills where they are, looking at using cloud-based computing and sharing and so on. So do they go through the process? Let's just rename this assignment 1. There we go. So do they go through the process of sharing this with me? Okay. And giving, the teacher the access to that document. Well, that's a good thing to teach students. Okay. But I'll be honest, sort of trying to structure that, and for the student themselves, understanding kind of where everything sits, I think, there's a real benefit to just funneling things through the assignments. Doesn't mean that they can't add extra things to the assignments, and we'll come through to that in a moment, but it does mean that they've got the ability to kind of keep things really, really structured. Questions come through. If we send a Word document through an assignment, where is it stored for the student? It's all stored in SharePoint. That's the key thing to understand. It's actually stored in the back end of SharePoint. So for the student, they access it in the same way as if I'd shared a file, through SharePoint itself, except they're funneling it through assignments. So what it actually does is saves in the back end in a folder under their name, and then once it's completed, it moves to a folder that's complete. So it's a work in progress until it's a folder that's complete. So thinking about then for the student, yes, they could go through this process and they could share via this method. Worst case scenario, I think in this context, is for them to email attach that to a teacher. Now, sort of, I think we know the email attachment method, and that's tried and tested. It's inefficient. There's ended up due to data duplication, and what we end up with for teachers is it feels like it's actually a really good method to use, but it's not. Because it, sort of we end up with data sprawl and data all over the place, and we don't really want that. So what we want to do is make sure that this is as well organized as possible. And that's where I think, sort of whether we're doing classwork or whether we're doing homework, we use assignments. That's the best way to organize things in that sort of structured sense. So for the teacher, using the assignments piece here. Okay. Do a refresh of that. I don't know quite why it's coming up with some strange characters there. There we go. Just make that a tiny bit smaller. Okay. Let that reload. Okay, so but for the teacher, thinking about kind of the different resources that we want students to return, if we know we want them to return a Word document, if we know we want them to return a PowerPoint presentation, sort of the easiest thing for us is to actually attach that to the assignment, but also for the student, it means it's really easy and quick for them to access as well. So if we take this example here that I've created, and let me just, if I go into edit the assignment, okay, we can see that I've attached 2 Word documents for the students. That means that what I'm going to get back as the teacher is 30 documents with each student essay question, each student, sort of the essay document. And it's not stopping them from attaching documents as well. So if they wanted to be able to attach a document, they can, or a file, they can. But it does mean that I've got kind of that structure where I'm not expecting people to kind of add things to folders in different places and so on. It does also mean that if I'm using that, I can use things like the rubrics. And for the students, that means that they've got access to the success criteria. They've got access to the marking scheme that we might be using. And we can also then do things like add it to the calendar. So if we switch over to Angela and just pop into her Teams, okay, that essay that I've set for her is sitting in her calendar. It's due in half an hour, okay, and she can click on that. And then if we just open that up, that's sitting there for her to be able to go and view that assignment. Okay, so just as a quick point here, what the student can also do is potentially think about using Outlook to be able to organise their points. So obviously Teams is leveraging Outlook here. So actually what we can do, if we just reopen that a second, is we could set up categories here. Okay, so it could be that if I go into Outlook and I say, okay, English is red, maths is orange, geography is green, for instance, science is yellow, and so on, I could set different categories and different colours for different subject areas, which means that then when I go into use those categories, I can see across my week, the different things that I need to do. So if I put this in as red, okay, and close that, then for me, that's appearing as red, and then another assignment could be here in green and so on. And I can actually visually sort of pick out the different subject areas. So that's just one idea about sort of thinking about organisation. And teaching students to use things like category colours is no bad idea, but it's a sort of a way for them to be able to organise things. Now, I would suggest that that's quite a secondary related suggestion. I'm not sure that primary school students would do that, or that you'd need them to, but certainly for secondary FE and college, that's potentially quite a useful kind of way to approach it. I still think adding the assignment to the calendar, whether they're primary school students or secondary school students, is no bad thing. For primary school students, if we were to add emojis to the assignment title, so that we can actually kind of put a book at the beginning, you know, a math symbol at the beginning and so on. That's going to make that quite pictorial for them as well, so that they can find that quite easily. And that's kind of an alternative to thinking about using color coding, just using kind of emojis at the beginning. And if you're using a Windows computer, you know, it's as simple as using the Windows and the full stop key together to get the emoji keyboard up, in which case then you can pick your emojis as you need to. So as an example here, if I were to go to this one and do Windows dot, there we go. And then we'll do emojis and a book. Okay, and we'll use that one there. Okay. Now I've got that at the beginning of my essay title. Okay, and it does mean then for the student, when that refreshes, that will actually show with the emoji there as well. Okay, so key thing for us is that the students are able to access what they need to. They're able to find what they need to. So if we go into this, actually, I'm just going to quit the Teams app there. There we go. Stop that flashing. Okay. Let's open this one up. Okay. So if I then click on the view assignment, that's going to take me through to the assignment. Now I can access it through my calendar. We'll talk about different sort of accessing points in a moment. But if I access that through my calendar, then I'm straight into here. Let's use the web app for this one. Okay. Let that load up. So thinking about for the student experience, they're able to use the calendar to manage their ability, their whole week. Something also to point out is that teachers obviously need to set their assignments to appear in the calendar. You do have the option when you're setting the assignment to have that appear in your calendar as well. It depends on how many classes you teach as to whether you want that to be the case. It can be quite a good way to organise your assignments. But certainly for the students, I think definitely having it appear in their calendar is I think it's a no-brainer, to be honest. Teaching them how to use their calendar, keeping that kind of online diary option. Okay, so for the student thinking about accessing the assignment here, certainly teaching them about the presence of the immersive reader in the assignment. As long as they know what the immersive reader is, teaching them the book and the sound icon together means that if you do have any students with any kind of additional needs, that does appear here in the immersive reader for the assignment itself with the instructions. That can also be really useful for students who are, if you've got any primary students who are quite young, then they might need, potentially if they're emerging readers, they might need some help with some of the reading there. Effectively, this can read it aloud to them. Okay, so that can be quite useful for those younger students, and certainly for any students with accessibility needs. Okay. We've also got the rubric. So if you've attached your mark scheme, then they've got access to that criteria there. Okay, and if you've marked it, that will also show for the students when they've actually got their assignment back as well. Okay, so they can easily then just go straight into the Word document. I appreciate the question that we had about where does it live for the student. The most important thing is how do they access it? And actually, just by going into the assignment, clicking on the file, and being able to go in and access that, because we've handed it in. Okay, that is in read-only mode at the moment. Okay, so it's actually showing without the ability to edit. But if I undo the hand in, okay, that will then change the permissions for me in SharePoint. So all of this in the back end is kind of picking up kind of those SharePoint permissions and saying, right, okay, hold on a second, I need to give the student editable access to this document. Okay, and it will go through the process of allowing them to edit that. So just go, there it is there. Okay, so now when I click open, that should take me straight into the editable version of Word, in which case I can edit that directly here. And whether that's a Word document, whether that's OneNote, whether it's Excel, PowerPoint, whatever the resource that we're using is, we've got the editable access. If we're thinking about self-reflection for students, we can think about getting them to use the comment feature. So again, sort of they'll be used to using Word potentially, depending on their age group and how long they've been doing different things around IT, but certainly, sort of the typing is fairly standard. They'll know how to use sort of a fair amount of this, but things like the comment feature. So, for instance, if they wanted to answer this point here, by adding a comment for themselves, help. Okay. You also tag the teacher into this as well, by the way. You can teach them to mention the teacher if they want to tag in. But it could be that they've actually just remembered that there's something about how he could be perceived as a villain. So, sort of perhaps they want to remind themselves of a quote. So they could say Act 2, Scene 4, for instance. Okay, so it's just them being able to perhaps use that as a reference guide while they're working on the document, but they also could use it as a self-reflection piece. So when we're actually coming down to let me just bring this across here. Okay, so we come down to the answer here. The student could be actually highlighting a part of their text and talking about how they have actually completed some work, or how they have, sort of answered a part. And it could be that they're reminding themselves of something they need to add at a later point. Okay, so let's go and have a look at kind of an assignment from where the student's been marked. Okay, so let's pick up here. Get the right one here. Okay, so we did have Jane Austen open. Let's just pick her again. Okay, there she is. Okay, so here we've got Jane Austen. Okay, she's got her assignment. Okay, and it says the assignment details have been modified because I just did that a moment ago. But when we click on the view assignment, this is one where she's been given feedback. Now, how does she know she's been given feedback? Teaching the students that they can use the activity at the top there. That's going to tell them, okay, that they've had an assignment returned back to them, that assignments have been added, that they've been, app mentioned, all of those things around here, sort of in their feed. Teaching them how to use that feed is sort of very, very useful for them. Okay, so let's just go back to our teams here. There we go. So if we go into their completed, remember that they've got their assigned, so that's all the ones that they have got that they need to complete. They've also got this completed tab, so they can go to their prior exam questions, okay, and they can see kind of when things have been handed in. Let's just go back here a second. There we go, there's the one we're actually looking at. Okay, and we can see the feedback here, okay, and if you've attached any kind of video feedback to that, we've now got the option to give video feedback in Teams. If you've attached any video or audio feedback, if you've attached any files, they would also appear here as well. Okay. Now, for the student, when they are completing their assignment, they can attach work themselves as well. Okay, so if I go back here a second, okay, for this, actually, we'll go back in. This student's handed this in. They have the option to perhaps carry on working on this. Perhaps they've got the option to add some extra resources, or we ask them to build upon their previous response. Effectively, they can go back and carry on working on the document that's here, but they can also attach something. So teaching students that they can attach a link to a resource, they can upload something from their device. So a good example, if they want to take a photograph of their handwritten work and they want to include that in here, or their handwritten planning notes, perhaps if it's a piece of maths work, they could, sort of have their working out, they can attach that into here as well. It doesn't just have to be things that we attach into the assignment workflow. But the key thing for us is that keeps that all in one place. So going back to that previous conversation about, should students be using things in their OneDrive? Well, they can do, but then they can attach that to the assignment kind of piece moving forward. Thinking about kind of other software that they might use within Office 365, for instance, if they were to use Sway, which I'll come to in a moment, if they were to use Sway, for instance, they could provide a hyperlink to that Sway. They could attach that as a link in here as well. Okay, so just thinking about kind of how they can get the most out of this assignments piece, so it can be really, really powerful for them. Okay, and of course, then they can hand that back in if they need to. So let's think about the rest of the kind of the Office 365 environment. Teams is really, really powerful for being able to become a one-stop shop. And if you're using any kind of resources within your team, so for instance, if I go into the general channel here, there we go. If you are using any tabs at the top, like I've got my 8 different tabs here, that could be that you're adding in a form, it could be that you're adding in different points. So getting them to understand how you have structured your team in terms of the channels, in terms of the tabs, get them to understand how they can do group work using private channels. If you've set them up a private channel to do some group work, like we've got this one here, okay, sort of where they can be working collaboratively together. And actually, when we're thinking about teaching students about using Office 365 and Microsoft, is thinking about the collaborative aspects. So actually setting up routines around how they collaborate on a document in the same way as we need to for us as sort of professionals working with each other. So if I'm working on a policy document, for instance, and I want to work collaboratively with other members of, say, the senior leadership team, we have to have a kind of a way that we work together. And actually what I need to do as a teacher, if I'm doing that in the classroom, is set up those routines as well, and think about kind of how they're going to collaborate together on those documents, and using protected environments like private channels within Teams can be really practical for that, because it gives students a specific space that they can be in, but it also means that you can sort of work with them on their digital responsibility as well as just how they access things. So it can act for both points, because if you've got 30 students in a channel together and one's being silly, it can distract everyone else. But actually, if you've got them in smaller groups, it means that you can actually sort of feed into that. And part of that conversation we're having with students is about their digital responsibility. This is a good way to help them to find things easily, but also for them to be responsible in their own space. Okay, so if we go back up to our waffle, okay, we do have, if we just choose here, if you are in Teams, you will only get access to the standard apps that are there on the screen. So I'm just going to click on Microsoft 365, take me back to my home screen. Okay. For the students, they do have, quite a range of different applications that they can access. One of the key things that they might not have had access to, or they might not understand why they'd want to use, is Sway. And when we're thinking about students creating outcomes, particularly if they've got sort of lots of multimedia. So I was talking to a school last week around art portfolios and creating a piece of artwork, and how students can use Sway as a way of sort of showcasing different stages of that piece of artwork. And I mean, that, I was talking to a secondary art teacher about this, but there's no reason why students in a primary context couldn't show kind of their build up and their understanding. So, for instance, I was talking to a primary school again last week about using this for storytelling and actually getting students to create their stories using cards within a Sway. Okay, so if I, in fact, I'll take this one as an example. Okay, let that load up very quickly. There we go. So they can effectively, you give them a template if you wanted to, they can use then pictures, they can use, sort of different options in terms of text and video and so on. But by building that web page, they've then got kind of lots of their resources put together into one place that they can then share very easily with you as a hyperlink. So teach them how to use Sway in its basic kind of form. So using kind of the different cards, different images, and that kind of thing. But then also thinking about how they share it. So teaching students to share links, knowing that they are sharing view links. That it could be people in our organisation. It can be if it's not got any kind of personal identifiable information, it could be something they share anyone with a link. So if you're doing something that's got like a real world context where we actually want to share it out to a real world audience, we can do that using Sway without it being an issue of kind of letting people into the Office 365 environment. And it means that they can share out to an external kind of organization if they needed to. So for instance, if they were putting together a charity event in collaboration with a charity, they could actually share, some of the content. We just need to be careful that what's in there isn't personally identifiable to individual students, and that we're careful about images and that sort of thing. But certainly kind of in terms of their work, we can kind of have that available. Certainly if we're going with anyone in our organisation, that means the student can share that with the teachers that they're working with. So effectively all they would need to do is grab that link, okay, and then they can then add that to an assignment. They could embed it in a comment in Teams. So there's lots of different ways that they could share that with teachers. They could also work collaboratively together here. So again, this is sort of a really interesting environment for students to be able to utilize to access ways to approach their outcomes that aren't necessarily kind of the standard traditional ways. But what it also does is takes away kind of a lot of the faff that we get with things like asking them to create a PowerPoint, because effectively they can use the design features within Sway to effectively desktop publish the page for them. Okay, so then thinking about their other kind of areas within the Office portal, we do have the change that's happened sort of fairly recently, sort of around how we access things within Office 365, within Microsoft 365. So I actually teach them about the two options here for create and my content can also be very, very useful for students. It's a quick fire way. They can go into create, then they've got document, presentation and so on, and they can easily kind of go into it, any of those different arenas. And they can also go into templates. Now, if we've set up any templates within our organisation, so if we've set up within our school any templates, they could appear here and then students could use those. It's actually also useful for teachers and so on as well. So for instance, we've got some Tablet Academy templates that we might use. Okay, so like our PowerPoint presentations and so on, those have been saved in and we can access those. Thinking about students, we could have different templates for planning, we could have different templates for storyboarding and so on. So effectively we can have that click and create and actually have access to a range of different things from within the school, personalized from within the school. Okay. We do have access to the My Content area here as well. So if I just go up as Jane Austen here to My Content, okay, we can see things that are recently opened. Teaching students about the search is possibly the most powerful thing you can do. Okay, so thinking about how students find their different documents and so on, one of the biggest problems, particularly for either learners that struggle with organisation or certainly younger learners as well, is finding things. And actually, to be honest with you, for a lot of you teachers as well, But using that search, just being able to do a quick keyword search, and we're not just searching for the name of the file, we can be searching through the whole file itself, through keywords, and for the students, they should be able to then find those documents fairly easily. So, for instance, if I do a search for the word green, okay, that come up, okay, and I go to files, okay, I can see documents that are here, and I can actually then filter those down by the different Word document, Power, PDFs, and so on. So if I'm looking for something that I'm searching for as a student, I can find those documents sort of fairly easily. Okay, and again, this can be really useful for staff as well. Okay. Okay, so we're coming up to the point of close there. If anybody's got any questions, you're more than welcome to put those into the chat. Just as a quick kind of point, remember that we've got the Wakelet that's available for you. I will be adding some extra resources from Microsoft to that into from a student perspective, thinking about kind of how students engage in Office 365, how they can kind of really make the most out of using the different areas. Most importantly, just bringing this back to the digital skills that they need to move forward. So, you know, thinking about kind of how they access Office 365 is about developing kind of actually their digital skills moving forward, and sort of really bringing that back home to them, that they're not just using this for school for now, but actually they're developing future ready skills as well. Okay, so I'll just bring you back to the PowerPoint in case we need that Wakelet code. Just say thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you on a future webinar in the coming months. Okay, thanks everybody.